Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, June 13th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Alaska and the House primary special election that occurred this past Tuesday. Now, the state of Alaska conducted this election through all mail-in voting, meaning that voters had to submit their ballots via an absentee ballot, and it was just the way that you voted should you have voted by mail in the 2020 election or any election prior. And in the state of Alaska, the reason why we are holding an election is because the longtime Alaska representative, the sole representative at that, Don Young, had passed away, and as a result, the governor has now called a special election. And we got some early returns from the primary special election in which we now know who the top three contenders are advancing to the eventual general election with one open spot. This race is very interesting because now we have seen Governor Sarah Palin, the former governor of Alaska, the vice presidential nominee to the late Senator John McCain, is running for House of Representatives to replace Don Young. The reason also why this race is so significant is because Don Young has been in office for quite some time. It's not as if he was someone who was in for a decade or two, but rather for 3-4 decades, a significant period of time. In fact, when you take a look at the state of Alaska on our map here, you will find that in every election from the beginning of when this website uses documentation, 1976 till 2020, Don Young has been the Republican nominee and congressional incumbent in the state of Alaska. And in nearly every single election, this race has been mainly non-competitive. It has only more recently become competitive due to Don Young's old age. He was actually the oldest U.S. rep at the time, being 89 years old in 2020 when he was reelected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He won that election by 9 percentage points. So Democrats saw what happened in Alaska in the 2020 presidential election and found that Alaska actually voted for Donald Trump by a margin of just 10 percentage points. It was the first time that Alaska had narrowed down to such a margin in a tremendous period of time, and Democrats were looking to it as a potential pickup opportunity in the next 10 to 20 years. While 2022 was never realistic, especially now given our national environment, Democrats were at least slightly hopeful about their performance in this primary election. The reason being that the House election, like I showed you, was less than 10 points. Don Young defeated his Democratic opponent by less than 10 percentage points, ultimately resulting in a margin around 9.1%. The margin of victory wasn't super substantial, and Democrats were hoping that they would have an opportunity to pick up the race, especially as Sarah Palin has introduced herself back into electoral politics in the state of Alaska. The Democrats, on their hand, have only one nominee that could potentially make it to the final four, as the three other candidates that have advanced to the general election are two Republicans and one independent, Dr. Al Gross. Now, Dr. Al Gross's name might ring a bell for a good reason. He ran for Senate in the state of Alaska back in 2020. Now, he actually lost to Dan Sullivan by a margin more than what Biden had performed in the state of Alaska, meaning that Dr. Al Gross, as a Democrat, underperformed Joe Biden across the state. As a result, Al Gross returned to his independent affiliation and now is running as an independent. Independents in Alaska typically do well in terms of not necessarily every election, but they recently had an independent governor who was elected back in 2014, a red wave year with a Republican incumbent being in office. They've elected a Democrat to the governorship. They had a Democratic senator as recently as 2015. So the state of Alaska isn't exactly against voting for independents nor Democrats. So Democrats at least thought that they might have some type of opportunity within this race. But as we now see from these results, that clearly is not the case, and we have a bunch of interesting things coming out of it, but one thing is clear. The Democratic Party is certainly not the favored party within this race. Of those advancing to the general election, you have Sarah Palin, you have Nick Begich, and you have Dr. Al Gross. As for the remaining candidates, we have yet to see who ends up in the top finishing position. Right now, it seems to be a two-way race between a Democrat and a Republican. Santa Claus is running for Congress. That's something I should have mentioned way earlier on. There is a candidate running in the state of Alaska that has legally changed their name to Santa Claus, who is now running on a campaign that is more focused and more geared around democratic socialism, much more leftist policies than what we've seen for other candidates across the race. But he is also not running as a Democrat, but rather running as an independent. But realistically, he is not going to make it into the final four. There are two candidates ahead of him, a Democrat and a Republican, and it looks like, based off of where we are right now, with 72% of precincts reporting, that the Democrat will end up in the final bit of the race. Not exactly someone who we overwhelmingly expected to win this race, but a result that can be somewhat expected, knowing that there are Democratic voters in the state of Alaska. Now, it is a bit interesting to see that the Republican Party vote share is pretty significant relative to where it was in the past, and it makes a lot of sense. But I would also like to say that there are Democrats here who could have voted for a Republican or could have voted for an independent. The two-party breakdown isn't going to look kindly for the Democratic Party, mainly because the GOP has such a significant portion of the vote. But I will also say, this is not a standard type of election where even Democrats thought they might have a shot at this general election, or there is a Democratic primary. This is a jungle election with every single political party, independents as well, thrown into the mix, and the final four will end up on the ballot. So I find that to be quite interesting and quite different from what we expect in traditional congressional races, but it also might result up in an outcome in which Democrats are entirely locked out of the general election. Should the Republican, T. Sweeney, I'm not entirely sure the Democrat or the Republican's name here, just because when I was looking at the candidate list here, the ones that really struck out were the top three and Santa Claus. So looking at this congressional race right now, I'm quite surprised by the results, but it makes sense. Voters were never going to actually vote for Santa Claus anyway. But looking at the possibility that three Republicans might end up in the advancing candidates, that leaves Dr. Al Gross as the sole only other candidate who turns away from the GOP, who represents an ideology and a group that isn't the Republican Party. And that could be very interesting for the state of Alaska. But the initial results are very, very clear. The Democratic Party is not at all favored to be competitive, to win, or come close within the state of Alaska. But it is also clear on the Republican side about who voters prioritized and who voters want. Voters, altogether, want a Republican. They want someone to represent them from the GOP. And it seems as if Sarah Palin, the former governor, is the most popular candidate by plurality, receiving 29.8% of the vote in the initial primary. Now, Nick Begich's name might ring a bell simply because of his last name. He is a notable name only because of his last name. If you take a look at the 2022 race in the state of Alaska, let's fast forward to the 2022 House elections and take a look individually at the state of Alaska. Nick Begich actually comes from a political family that normally aligns with the Democratic Party. Looking at the election here, Nick Begich III, if we take a look at the candidate list here, he is the grandson of the former U.S. Representative Nick Begich and the nephew of the former U.S. Senator Mark Begich and the Alaska Senate Minority Leader Tom Begich. Now, Nick Begich, the initial one, was a Democrat. I had to double check that because I knew that his entire family had been Democrats, but I also hadn't heard much about Nick Begich because he actually had passed away, which resulted in this special election in which Don Young was elected. Looking at the U.S. Senator Mark Begich, he certainly was a Democrat. And Tom Begich is also certainly a Democrat. So looking at I'm surprised he's the minority leader. I thought at least the Democratic Party had the majority in the Alaska Senate, but things go back and forth because the Republicans like to move around. Nick Begich is a Republican, and he has name recognition because of his Democratic family. So it is interesting to see that he is now the second place contender against Sarah Palin, but realistically, Sarah Palin was always going to make it. Realistically, Nick Begich was always going to make it, and realistically, Al Gross was also always going to make it. Looking at these top three candidates, I am not surprised in the least bit. And when you take a look at the numbers leading into the results, what you found was that Dr. Al Gross, Nick Begich, and Sarah Palin typically ended up in the top three. The top four went back and forth between Santa Claus and Christopher Constant, a Democrat and an independent. Looking at the candidate who's now in the lead, Mary Sattler Peltola, I believe that's how you pronounce it, is in the fourth place position right now, but there is also no guarantee that they end up winning the general election or even make it to the general election. The Republican Party clearly comes out ahead here. The combined vote share for the GOP is overwhelming, and I think they should take this as a victory. Looking at the general election, it's ranked solid Republican, likely Republican, lean Republican, and that's all confirmed by the numbers that we have right now. But taking a look at some of the polls, I would also say that the GOP might be slightly skeptical about their ability to knock this out of the park. Some of the numbers tell us that in a matchup between Al Gross and Nick Begich, the margin of victory is a mere 9%, 10%. Right now, the GOP, based off of their initial numbers, should be defeating the Democratic Party 60-40, 65-35. Taking a look at other potential matchups, it shows here that should Sarah Palin make it to the general election against someone like Santa Claus, she actually ends up losing. But I honestly think that this number was very much geared and centered around the fact that there was an independent candidate named Santa Claus. I think voters like to be funny. I think those who answer polls also like to be funny. Realistically, Sarah Palin or Nick Begich are more than likely to defeat their other nominees that are going up against there. But I will also say that it's not going to be by this deafening margin based off these numbers, at least, that we otherwise thought. It's just very interesting to see the variation in the polls based off of who's running and the variation between the initial results and the general election. Keep in mind, voters also probably weren't too enthusiastic to vote in this initial primary. It's the first time that we've seen a jungle type of primary for the state of Alaska, and I'm sure that there are voters out there that were just entirely disengaged and unaware of this primary and how it occurred. You typically vote in a Democratic primary and a Republican primary, and that's how things have been in Alaska since its inception into the United States. But looking at how it is held now, this ranked choice voting has really changed this voting system dramatically, and voters probably aren't as aware or as tapped into politics as other people might think. But a general election is a general election. Ranked choice voting will reveal some interesting trends, but I generally think we should bet on two Republicans being in the final two. I think we should bet on Nick Begich and Sarah Palin to be in the final two against each other. And that will ultimately land with the Cook Political Report's rating of solid Republican. Obviously, two Republicans against each other means that whoever wins, it will be a Republican. It'd also be just quite interesting to see that ranked choice voting resulted in a position where two Republicans are faced up against each other rather than a Democrat versus a Republican or an independent versus a Republican. Because this system was meant to provide opportunities and voices to outside candidates and also outside parties that typically don't perform well across the state, and it will just be pretty ironic if it results with two Republicans at the final two in the U.S. House of Representatives, alongside the fact that that is more than likely going to happen in the U.S. Senate race between incumbent Senator Lisa Murkowski and Kelly Tshibaka, the Trump-endorsed candidate. So I rest my case about the Republican Party winning this special election in the state of Alaska. It makes a lot of sense. If I was to bet my money on anyone, I would say it would be Nick Begich at this point. While Sarah Palin did get more of the vote in the initial choice voting, this is what ranked choice voting is all about. I can guarantee you with near certainty that Democratic primary voters are going to go to the person they don't know rather than the person they do, meaning that they will vote for Nick Begich over Sarah Palin simply because they know and dislike Sarah Palin and do not want to see her in the House of Representatives. Now, of course, that is contingent on Nick Begich making it into the final two, but I see no reason why he wouldn't. I see no reason why our advancing candidates list here wouldn't be nearly identical in the November election for the first round of voting. Sarah Palin is simply so unpopular across the state of Alaska that I do not think she would win in a way that many people think. I do not think that she would landslide this election against Nick Begich, even with her name recognition and her statewide appeal, because there are a lot of voters that might like her, but certainly a lot more that dislike her. Her approval rating now isn't doing too well in the state of Alaska. What we've seen in terms of favorability polls is that they're almost all in the negative. Sarah Palin could make it to Congress, but it would rely on a matchup between a Democrat or an independent and herself. Because should it be between Nick Begich and Sarah Palin, nearly every single other voter will go for Nick Begich in this election than they will Sarah Palin. Is that the most electable choice? I don't know, because Sarah Palin, I think, would be easier to defeat in a future election. But of course, voters probably aren't thinking about who they want to defeat in the next election, but rather who they want to elect in this first one. Meaning that Sarah Palin probably is going to be ranked last by every single one of those people that voted for any Democrat or any left-leaning independent, such as Dr. Al Gross, and it will likely result in a loss for Governor Sarah Palin. But of course, it is neck and neck. The political betting markets won't really relinquish that neck-and-neck idea for this Alaska special election. It will be quite interesting to see how ranked choice voting ends up breaking down, how independent voters, how Democratic voters end up breaking across the state of Alaska. But it will be very fascinating, very interesting, and very telling for the future of ranked choice voting and the state of Alaska as we know it. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.